A year of lockdown has made it particularly challenging for learning. Classrooms have become virtual where people had access, but for many children, learning became sporadic or stalled altogether in the past year. And that's just the logistics. Once you consider the mental health aspect of lockdown on learning, the conversation widens. They say children are resilient, but are we providing the right kind of support in what has been a traumatic year? Educational psychologist Jessie Anne Bird joins us now this lunchtime via Skype. Jessie, good afternoon, welcome. Thank you very much for being with us this lunchtime on eNCA. Yeah, I mean, it's really been a roller coaster of a year emotionally and otherwise for many pupils and students in the country in the past year. For you, what has been the biggest challenge?
Sure. I think coming to grips with the unpredictability of it all. Waking up on a Monday morning and not knowing what's happening next. And I must say, for myself as an adult, as a psychologist, that was hard to deal with. I can only imagine what it must have felt like for, a school-age learner or their parents or teachers. The psychological ramifications of this have been huge.
Now, when you look at that part with the young ones, not being able to be with their friends as well, socialize as normally, that must have had some emotional price to pay.
Social interaction and peer interaction is an essential part of development. It's an essential part of human functioning, but especially so for developing brains and developing personalities. And I think this has been incredibly hard for our children, not being able to see their friends when schools were shut down, and then having very stilted, controlled interactions when they were allowed to go back with restrictions.
Yeah, because being with friends and in a group of people also enables learning, doesn't it?
That is very true. There are many theories that point out the fact that children learn from one another as well as from adults in their lives, such as teachers and parents. And one of the things that, as much as we have tried with online learning, we cannot replicate that. We cannot replicate that group interaction entirely. And so much gets lost in the in-between.
Now, learning under lockdown has not been easy for anybody. I mean, and you can see from even the results of the matric from last year and the challenges that were there, and maybe some pupils have been held back a year, but hopefully nobody, not in big numbers. What can we take out of the past year going forward? Because currently we're hearing of a possible third wave, which we're hoping and is not going to be worse than the second wave. But we actually, as you said in the beginning, it's so unpredictable. We actually don't know. But what should we be doing differently going forward to manage this uncertainty?
In 2020, we were doing this for the first time. We were figuring it out bit by bit, and it was trial and error. I think what we need to look at is how do we reduce things like unpredictability? How do we have clear communication about school dates and when they will be opening and closing? But I think very importantly, how do we support learners in schools that do not have the same access to resources? How do we support learners at home who do not have the same access to things like internet or Wi-Fi? How do we ensure that learning can continue even when going into the classrooms may not always be possible? We've had a year to think about this. And I think we need to be taking real concrete steps to look at contingency plans, and especially reusing some of the things that we have learned that have worked, but also thinking about how do we improve and how do we become more proactive rather than simply reactive.
And finally, very briefly, the role of parents. What do you say to parents as an educational psychologist who have to deal with this, of course, every hour of their lives?
Sure. I mean, parents have suddenly had to become teachers. They've had to become, they've had to learn how to work from home themselves, many of them. I think a big thing, though, is to acknowledge the emotional impact that this might have had on them, and to think about how, as families, they could be supportive of one another and really be there for their children, not just on an academic level, but on an emotional level, to help guide them through these really, really challenging times.
Thank you very much. Educational psychologist Jessie Anne Bird for some insights there and advice. I mean, as we look back 1 year on in terms of the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdown that we've had since the 26th of March 2020 on children in education.